Good afternoon, everyone. I'm your Heiner, the director of the Center for Russian History and Eurasian Studies, and welcome to a special event for us. Professor Volodymyr Kulik, adjunct professor in the Division of Language, Culture, and Literature here at Stanford, and chief research fellow in the Institution of Politics and Ethnicity in the National Academy of Ukraine. Professor Kulik is not new face to Stanford, he's been here several times. I think this is the third stint here. He's been a visiting scholar in many universities, Columbia, Yale, and published in both languages, Russian, Ukrainian, and of course English, and a very prolific writer on the topics of politics of memory and identity and media discourse in present-day Ukraine. Most recently published a book that is very relevant to this topic today in our discussion in general of Ukraine nowadays about the politics of language in multilingual countries, the foreign experience and its relevance to Ukraine nowadays. And today we will talk about the language shift in time of war, the abandonment of Russian in Ukraine. And of course, as always, we will ask tough questions about the validity of the shift and what it means to all of us in Ukraine. It's a pleasure to have you, Volodymyr.
Thank you all for coming here. It's my extreme pleasure to be here back. It's a different setting than 18 years ago. But other than that, Stanford is still the same, and Stanford is still busy, and I appreciate your finding time and amidst your busy schedules to attend my lecture. So what I will be talking about is one of the most talked about phenomena in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion, namely the shift toward Ukrainian. So for many people it's a full switch. For others it's a shift. So there is a difference between these two concepts. Switches is like yesterday you spoke Russian, today you speak Ukrainian. The shift is you spoke mostly X language and a little bit of Y, and then next day or next week or next year you speak more and more of Y and less and less of X. And many people report their own change, either switch or shift, and also change around them. They report about their friends, colleagues, family, again, either switch or shift, and they also report about shift in society in certain domains. What I hear in the street, what I hear in the stores, in the bank, on the subway, and so on. So there is something there. Media report about that. Media write stories about particular people. Media report based on survey data. Lots of survey ask these questions. But these stories are kind of sporadic, not systematic, and the scholars have an obligation to systematize that. So this is something I intend to do. In my research, I've been studying language politics for almost 20 years now. I have a lot of survey data from different years, focus group data. I've also analyzed media discourse and social media discourse. And so now I will try, of course, it's not possible to squeeze all of that in one presentation, even if it's 40 minutes, but I will try to demonstrate the existence of this shift first, try to assess the scale of this shift, and try to present evidence how people talk about what motivates them. So what motivates them to change and to switch to Ukrainian, to shift to Ukrainian, and what motivates others to adhere to Russian. So all these three parts will be here. I will combine quantitative analysis, diachronic study of language behavior based on survey data from different years, from starting with 2012, and the last survey I am analyzing here is December 22, so almost a year into full-scale work, and also qualitative methods. So basically here I have a set of focus groups discussion in Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Chernivtsi. So the capital, second largest city in the east, very close to Russia border, and a city in the southwest, interesting in itself, but also as a destination of many IDPs from eastern part and southern part of Ukraine. So I had separate groups for IDPs in Chernivtsi, and in Kyiv and Kharkiv I had two groups each, depending on their wartime experience, whether they left and returned, whether they never left. Surveys, and in addition to focus group discussion, I also administered a detailed online survey, specifically intended to investigate the detail, the nuances of language use in different domains and motivations for changing or continuity. So the survey was administered in February 2023. I had 248 responses, so pretty much material, and I analyzed it in extreme detail. But first, I will report on these 4 nationwide surveys conducted by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, approximately 2,000 respondents in each, starting in 2012, before any change brought about by Euromaidan and the first invasion of Russia in Crimea and the Donbass. Then September 2014, after Crimea and the beginning of the conflict in the Donbass. Then 2017, in the middle of the process of post-Maidan reforms, including the language domain, and then December 2022. Keep in mind that these data are comparable territorially. Although the Ukrainian territory shrunk, I excluded the respondents in earlier surveys. I excluded the respondents from those territories which were lost later. So these are comparable data and comparable territory, which means that these are real changes in society rather than changes in territory. That's always a problem with some data sociologists present if they don't do things. Margin of errors around 3%, 3.3 was key reports in previous surveys, but in this survey, in addition to this 3%, there is a couple more percent of additional because of this large-scale dislocation. The data are vague, meaning if some group is underrepresented in the sample, their responses are multiplied to bring them in line their share in the sample. But still, sociologists are unable to make it fully in this within the 3% margin of error. But I will demonstrate you that the changes are much larger. So definitely, it's not an error. It's a real change in society. Okay. Finally, no matter how we build the sample, no matter how we weight the data, there is one thing we can do little about it, which is called social desirability bias. Especially in time of war, people tend to report what they believe will be approved by others, and even if you are talking on the phone. The last phone the last survey is a phone survey, of course, because of this large-scale dislocation, and 3 first surveys are face-to-face. So even if you are talking on the phone, there is something in you which brings you to say something which you expect to be approved by your interlocutor. We cannot measure that based on survey data. Experiments are needed to compare what people report openly responded, and then in experimental setting. My colleagues and I conducted first series of experiment, but it didn't proceed as yet, so I will not report on that. So keep in mind that these changes are partly not real changes, but changes to some extent. We don't know how much, probably not much, a couple of percent definitely. But again, what I will present is much larger than that. So there is definitely a real social change, but also it is a big exaggeration for the sake of social desirability. Okay, so let's begin with 2012 before all these changes. I mean, there were some changes for the first 2 decades of independence, but we'll analyze the last decade in detail. So the indicator here is the so-called language of convenience. It is defined as a language that the respondent chooses to speak in communication with bilingual and accommodated interviewers. Meaning interviewer switches back and forth and all the time asks what's convenient to the respondent and what language he or she normally uses and what language they respond in. It is taken as an indicator of their preference. So, convenience is a kind of slippery term. It's not necessarily. It's not. I would say like appropriate language respondent is considered appropriate for this type of communication. So it's not necessarily the language respondent uses himself or herself in their private communication. It's just for this type of communication, with the communication with a stranger, but institutionally empower a stranger. A stranger coming from a sociological organization, it means that this interaction is not fully private, even if conducted in the privacy of home or privacy of phone communication. It is semi-public communication because the interviewer represents this institutional body. Yeah. So this language. It is either Ukrainian or Russian in all these surveys. So you cannot say I'm fine with both, because interview needs to be in some language. So this is the language you end up with, demonstrating that you prefer this language. So you see almost perfect regional breakdown. Yeah, so 2 regions predominantly Ukrainian speaking and 2 regions predominantly Russian speaking. And here southeast meaning all southern and eastern oblasts except for Donbass and Crimea, which were at that time fully in Ukraine. Yeah, so the West and the Donbass, Crimea are almost fully unilingual. Yeah, and these 2 regions are with significant minorities, but still predominantly one language, so either Ukrainian or Russian. So let's now look at how it changed. So let's compare this language of convenience in 2012 and 2022. Keep in mind that the Crimea is gone, half of the Donbass is gone, so we have what I call south plus east here. It's all the oblasts except for those which were occupied by Russia in 2014. Yeah. So we see no longer polarization, no longer 2 symmetrical kind of parts of Ukraine. All 3 macro regions are rather similar, and this tremendous tectonic change has been achieved by truly impressive change in the south and east. Yeah, so from overwhelmingly Russian-speaking responses in 2012, they moved to overwhelmingly Ukrainian-speaking responses in 2022. Again, it's not necessarily the language they speak themselves in their private setting. That's the language they chose for interaction with the representatives of sociological company. So, meaning they need to be rather fluent in it. Yeah, you cannot fake it if you are going to talk for half an hour on a complicated topic. But also you need to consider this language appropriate. So if you are rather fluent in both languages, you might be more fluent in Russian, but you consider Ukrainian appropriate. Now, they didn't. It's not necessary that Ukrainian by definition was appropriate. Yes, in 2012, most people in the East and South consider Russian appropriate, no matter Ukrainian being the only official language for 20 years before that. Yeah. So, but now something like 75% of respondents in the East and South consider Ukrainian the important language for this communication. So again, if this is a bias, it's a bias backed by action. It's not just I report, I like it, or I report, I speak it. Yeah, it's I do speak it in this communication. And Kyiv actually has another indicator, not just language chosen at the beginning, but language enacted during the interaction for answering all these questions. So at the end, the interviewer reports what languages the respondent used in interaction, and there is some sliding back toward Russian, something like 10%. You can say 75% of people in the East and South reported chose Ukrainian at the beginning, but through the interaction, something like 65% sustained Ukrainian. But this is still huge. Yeah, so it is still truly impressive for the region, which is traditionally perceived as predominantly Russian speaking. Yeah, that's what it partly is, except it is changing. Yeah. Okay, and so this change in the East and South made a very significant change for the entire Ukraine. Yeah, so the change in the two other macro regions is not that big, especially in the West. It was predominantly Ukrainian speaking at the beginning, so there was nowhere to grow. So to say, yeah. But because of the change in the center, especially in the South and East, we have this huge change in entire Ukraine. So in 2012, it was rather 50-50. And now we have something like 85% of respondents chose Ukrainian. Okay, so another indicator. The main language of everyday use as reported by, not demonstrated, but reported by respondents. And here, you should keep in mind that unlike language of convenience, where you have either Ukrainian or Russian, here you can say it's both Ukrainian and Russian. So it's three-part kind of scale, yeah? So you have Ukrainian, you have both Ukrainian and Russian, and then you have Russian. So here I report the percentage of respondents reporting Ukrainian as their main language of everyday use for 2012, 2017, and 2022 in the Ukraine as a whole and the three main macro regions. So again, we see almost no change in the West. A very small but statistically significant change in the center, and an impressive change in the East and South. It's not nearly as impressive as it was for the language of convenience, but still you should keep in mind that it's only Ukrainian, and the rest is not Russian. The rest is both Russian and both Ukrainian and Russian. So it's almost 30% of people reporting preference for Ukrainian in everyday communication, and the rest is something like 30% of Russian and 40% both Ukrainian and Russian. So Ukrainian and Russian seem to be equal. Again, if you walk in the streets of the East and South, especially in the cities, you would not believe that. Yeah, you would say they're exaggerated. But first, it's not only cities; it's also countryside, which is predominantly Ukrainian speaking, except maybe for some parts of the Donbass. And also, it's not just that they exaggerate; they change. Yeah, they are in the process of change. And because of this huge change in the East and South, we see a very significant change in Ukraine as a whole. But you see that there was some change already in 2017. So there was a growth, except that now change between 2017 and 2022 is larger, maybe twice as large as it was the previous 5 years. Yeah. So, but we definitely see that the change here is not as impressive as for the language of convenience. There was really a switch, and here there is a shift, even though an impressive shift. Another important dimension is age. If there is a shift, younger people start changing. Younger people change more than older people, and we see that this is the case. I divided the sample in people below 30, so 18 it's adult population, so 18 to 29, and everybody above 30 years of age. And you see that the share of the share of Ukrainian is larger, and the share of Russian is smaller for younger people. And so this is a new phenomenon. It was not to be like that. Even though younger people were educated in Ukrainian and knew it better than older people who were partly or largely educated in Russian, the knowledge did not translate into use, into preference for using it when they had a choice. If anything, in some of the surveys I worked on previously, younger people were more Russian speaking. And now it is no longer the case. So now the shift is really starting. So because younger people are kind of motors of the shift. Yet another comparison. As everybody who knows about Ukraine knows, there is a discrepancy between the distribution of population by everyday language, by language they speak, and by language they consider native. So native language is a language identity, language which I call dear, which is more important to me, and which I want to maybe be spoken in society, even spoken by my children, but I don't necessarily speak it myself. It's hard for me. I was raised that way, or the environment pressures, and for various reasons. And there is this significant gap between language identity and language practice. So many people. Many of those who consider Ukrainian native still speak Russian as their main language of everyday use. So the share of Russian by everyday language is always higher than the share of Ukrainian. But the gap grew even larger in 2017 because the change by native language was faster. And now the gap is closing because many more people not only shift by native language, but also shift by everyday language. So they not only identify as Ukrainian, which is understandable in time of aggression by Russia, but they also start speaking Ukrainian. Yeah, so that's the change, that's the response we wanted all along, and it didn't happen. And finally, it is happening. Yeah, so it's really a historical change. And final dimension of the survey data is a comparison of language in different practices. Here I am presenting language of home and language of work or study. And impressively, we see a change in their respective shares between 2017 and 2022. Before that, there was more Ukrainian at home than at work. It seems strange, because Ukrainian was official language. Ukrainian should have been the language of work primarily, yeah, and Russians could be kept at home. But it was no longer, it was not the case. Many people who spoke Ukrainian at home were forced to speak Russian at work. For all the talk of Russia and some political forces in Ukraine about forced Ukrainianization, there were in fact classification, and not necessarily forcible, but there was social pressure. There was pressure from peers, there was pressure from superiors, there was pressure from customers, from many, and so on. So now it is gone. Now there was even more Ukrainian at work than at home. And it is not necessarily a result of the war, it's also the result of the legislation, especially the 2019 language law, which made Ukrainian mandatory, finally made Ukrainian really mandatory in all domains, especially at work. And not only in public sector, but also in private establishments. So the default language of employees interacting with customers is Ukrainian now. And when I say it's not necessarily about the war, it is still partly about the war because there would have been, in my opinion, there would have been more resistance to the implementation of this law if it were not for the war. The war gave a stimulus to implement the law. If you want to protest against Russian aggression by speaking Ukrainian, the interaction in establishments is a good place to do so. There is much more inertia in private domain. It's harder to speak Ukrainian with your family, and it's harder to speak Ukrainian, a different language, than previously with your old-time friends. But it is okay to speak with salespeople. It is okay to speak with bank tellers. It is okay to speak with public servants in state establishments. So that's where the change was primarily implemented. Beyond the behavior, let's talk a few words about say a few words about the preferences for the situation in society. It's not only what I do; it's what I want others to do. It's what I want to see around me. So here is responses to the question of what language situation you prefer for the future. So how should the language situation in Ukraine develop in the near future? No, not near future, in the future, perspective it was in Ukrainian. The preference for Ukrainian was seen already in 2012, but it was not a lot. It was almost 50-50. So, just a little bit more for Ukrainian than for bilingual. So the choice was here between Ukrainian in all domains, bilingual country, and Russian in all domains. So you see the preference for Russian was almost minuscule, but the preference for bilingual country was really significant. And for many people saying I want bilingual, meaning I want Russian around me, and I want Ukrainian someplace else. Yeah, for many Russian speakers in the East and South, that meant that Ukrainian should be spoken in the West, but not by us. Not near us. So when they wanted bilingualism, they wanted bilingualism for the country as a whole, but not for their lives. They did not mean that they should be obliged to use Ukrainian anywhere with Ukrainian-speaking customers, for example. No. Now again, it is a strong preference for Ukrainian in society as a whole, but also. Even more impressively, Russian speakers. So this is a Russian speaking part of the sample. Russian speakers themselves prefer Ukrainian to be spoken in society rather than bilingualism. They used to strongly prefer bilingualism, and now, for the first time, more than half of them prefer Ukrainian as the main language of all social domains. That's again a really impressive change. Okay. Enough of quantitative data. I'm afraid I will burden you. So now, at least something about qualitative data. So focus groups here, FG, and in the next slides it will be about OS online survey. So a couple of quotes: how people change, how people explain why they change. Obviously, number one priority, number one reason is response to the war. I don't feel like speaking the language spoken by the aggressor, who tries to kill us and grab our lands. So that's very widespread. So that's just one quote of dozens, a very widespread explanation why I don't want to speak Russian, why I want to speak Ukrainian. And by the way, in Kyiv, again, now it's very impressive. In focus groups. In my focus groups, I instructed the moderators to speak Ukrainian consistently, but allow respondents to use Russian if they feel difficult to speak Ukrainian. And previously, in 2015, when I had previously these focus groups, in Kyiv, maybe 1/3 of respondents actually spoke Ukrainian. Most of them started with Ukrainian during the introduction and then gradually switched to more and more and more, and finally Russian only. In Kharkiv, it was Russian only from the very beginning. Of course, in Chernivtsi there was more Ukrainian. Now in Kyiv, everybody really spoke Ukrainian throughout the 2-hour-long discussion. So they demonstrated their reports, their accounts, they backed them by their actual language behavior. And so the second quote demonstrates a more pragmatic reasoning. So I started communicating more in Ukrainian because many people around me have started speaking Ukrainian. So it's a conformist approach. So I speak the language spoken by others around me, and in public, I speak more Ukrainian because many people speak Ukrainian in public. At home, I still speak in Russian because people around me still speak Russian. So, but that pragmatic, that conformist behavior leads to this predominance of Ukrainian primarily in public communication, at work, in banks and shops, on the subway and in public offices especially, than in private communication. So that's how it should be for majority-minority relations. Yeah, so majority language is spoken primarily in public. It dominates heavily in the public communication. In private communication, some people speak other languages. Yeah, so we have that in many countries, including this one. Yeah, so but Ukraine was different. In Ukraine, very many people spoke Russian in public and didn't care about the status of Ukrainian as the only official language. So now this is also changing. And the third quote is from Chernivtsi Chernivtsi IDP group, Chernivtsi group of people who are now in Chernivtsi, or were in August 22 at the time of the groups, but came from different regions, primarily from the eastern and southern regions, which were heavily affected by the war. So this woman says, I dreamed of practicing Ukrainian, but I was shy. In Kharkiv, it was somehow awkward. In Chernivtsi, it was no longer awkward, so she was happy to practice this language where everybody spoke around, where everybody was welcoming and supported. Here, a couple was from Kharkiv, and they show different reasoning. The first one, the shift toward Ukrainian. I try to speak Ukrainian more because I just express my respect for armed forces of Ukraine and for Ukrainian nationality. Even though, in general, I'm pragmatic. I speak many languages, and language. The choice of language depends on how people understand each other. Yeah, so it's very pragmatic approach, but here I make an exception. Yeah, so I stop being pragmatic and start being symbolic or patriotic. Yeah, so I want to support Ukraine and Ukrainian nationality, so I speak Ukrainian. But the second quote demonstrates that not all people reason like that. Not all people behave like that. So this person believes there is no need to do anything, particularly for himself. There is no need to do anything. There is enough of Ukrainian, so Ukrainian is spoken everywhere on TV and documentation in Ukrainian. But and he contradicts himself, but he doesn't realize that. Whether you want it or not, you will learn and use it. Of course, there is too little practice. So use it or little practice. So if I try to speak Ukrainian, everybody will tell me better speak Russian. Okay, he's happy. He's happy to do so. He believes there is no need to change, meaning no need to change for anybody, including himself or primarily himself. So that's how different Kharkiv was from the two other cities. So in Kharkiv, even now, most people in focus groups still spoke Russian, and many people said they strongly or mildly they said that there is no need to do anything, especially for myself. Yeah. Online survey. Here we can see details of how people switch, not only why, but how, when. The first quote report is a report of an abrupt change. I switched to Ukrainian in 2012 when I came to realize that there had become more Russian than Ukrainian in Ukraine. 2012 is the Yanukovych time, adoption of this Kivalov-Kolesnichenko law, so seemingly the state pushes for Russification, and many people protest against it, including by their own behavior. So it was statistically insignificant, of course, but for many people it was important. And by the way, my survey is by no means statistically significant, statistically representative. So I advertising on Facebook, and my friends advertising on Facebook. So it was more like snowball effect, and heavily represented by people like myself. Yeah. So I could not get many other segments of the population, but there was a significant part of people who actually reported different behavior and different reasoning, meaning opposition to this shift to Ukrainian and perception of language policy as discriminating and even oppressive. Yeah, so the first change is abrupt, and the second is gradual. So I first read Ukrainian literature, then during the Revolution of Dignity, I started gradually switching to Ukrainian I work in public communication and my studies, so mostly in public. Then in 2017, 2018, I started switching to Ukrainian with friends and people I was close to, so in a circle. And by the full-time invasion, my communication in Ukrainian and Russian was the most equal. With the war, I speak Ukrainian 90% of the time, except for those moments when English is needed. So that's an impressive story of a gradual change, and it is related to important developments in society. So it's not like many other people report different things. Falling in love, finding a job, moving to another city. So there were more pragmatic reasons for changing. But here the change in Odessa, predominantly Russian speaker, maybe she would fell in love with somebody who speaks Russian. Maybe she studies where Russian was okay. But her inner motivation was related to the changes in society because of these momentous events. Let's look at how these people evaluate state policies. The majority of my Ukrainian-speaking respondents, that they were overwhelmingly dominating the sample, evaluate state policies positively. The state policies were good for society. They created preconditions for speaking Ukrainian. They put some pressure on those who didn't want to. So that was very well. And this woman says language law of 2019 allowed me to demand Ukrainian in service establishments. Previously, I could not demand. I didn't have the right. I wanted it, and some salespeople accommodated my preferences, but others didn't, and I could not really pressure. I could boycott. I could not go to those places, but normally I didn't have enough choice. So everybody spoke Russian, and where could I show? And so that was important. Now I have the right, and I could exercise it. But there was another a minority choice, a minority opinion, saying it's not good to pressure them. It's not good to beat into heads by methods of intimidation, coercion, and violence. So this person believes that Ukrainian language must be prestigious and attractive, and so this is the reasoning which was predominant probably before 2012, definitely, maybe before 2014, definitely, but some kept it even before 2022. So Ukrainian language should be prestigious. You should create more content in it. You should not pressure anybody. People should be attracted by themselves. So the question, what to do with those who are not attracted, how to force them to use it in the workplace, was omitted somehow. So if this person is not attracted to the Ukrainian language and he or she doesn't want to use it when servicing others, how the rights of those others are violated was omitted. So now this question is addressed by this language legislation. Yeah. So but still some people believe it's not good. Some people, even among Ukrainian speakers, so this person's reports speaking primarily Ukrainian in all practices, but he still evaluates this policy negatively. But among those who speak Russian and who wants to speak Russian, definitely the assessments of the language policy by the state is strictly negative. And not only the state, but also Ukrainian speakers. How behaviors of Ukrainian speakers is perceived as aggressive. So after this person reports, I used to speak Ukrainian, I supported the gentle promotion of Ukrainian, keyword gentle. So the promotion of Ukrainian might not be aggressive. So if it is very gentle, so I almost not feel it, it's okay. But if it results in pressure on myself, then it's not okay. Yeah. So after 2014, I no longer made such effort because I started noticing that it played into the hands of those who discriminated Russian speakers and tried to mark them as wrong Ukrainians. Now the situation has become even worse. So this perception that the attitude toward Russian speaking was discrimination was a very strong motivation for such people not to support the Ukrainization and try to oppose it by every means possible. Some say, I never speak Ukrainian. Some say I speak it, but I don't force to when I'm at work. Some said, oh, I also use it on the social media, otherwise they will torture me and meaning discursively. But other than that, I speak Russian. So for some people, it was a feeling of injustice. So Russian speakers, including myself, were first robbed of their home by the army of the Russian Federation. And now our own people deprive me of the right to be myself, to realize myself in a language which I speak since birth. So regardless of the fact that for very many people, Ukrainian is now a language in which they want to be themselves, there are some people who still want Russian as their language of selfhood. Yeah. So and they oppose this social pressure, let alone the requirements to speak Ukrainian in certain practices. So they are very negative about that. They consider this unjust and counterproductive. So here some attitudes of Russian speakers towards the state language policy. In the long run, it is a time bomb which will evoke an opposite reaction as soon as the acute phase of the war is over. So this person realizes that as long as the war goes on, many people feel this not even the pressure, but motivation, inclination to speak Ukrainian, to support the shift toward Ukrainian. But once the war is over, there might be an opposite reaction. So it is still possible. We will see how this data change and how this motivation change. But the final quote I wanted to show you is the evaluation that there is still a critical mass of Russian speakers which will not allow this language shift to become real, to become full scale. So it will be possible to turn Russian into a merely language of everyday communication, which is a shift in itself. An informal written use, but it will hardly be possible to raise the next generation as truly Russian speaking. This perception pertains here to the south and east, but we may ask this question about the country as a whole. So my guess is that in Kyiv it is possible. In Kharkiv and Odessa it's hardly. So, but we need to seize it. To conclude, so there is an impressive language shift in Ukrainian society, particularly during the last Civil War, but we saw some shift already by 2017. Ukrainian is becoming the main language of all public domains, but also the main language of everyday use by most people. East and South are becoming less dissimilar from the West and Center. So the country is becoming more united, and that contributes to solidarity and resilience in the face of aggression. War and state policies, including the language law of 2019, are main motivation for shift toward Ukrainian. In contrast, identity and resentment are main motivation for opposing Ukrainization and adherence to Russia. Finally, coming back to what I said before, it is not clear how big the scale really is, because it's not clear how truthful people are when they report their behavior, how they are affected by the social disability bias. So we need to monitor changes further, especially if the war becomes protracted, or if the war ends, if the war maybe gets frozen. So we need to see how it changes, and we need to conduct to use experimental methods to try to get to people's real behavior rather than what they consider to be a problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First, thank you for the presentation. It's wonderful that you are researching such a topic. my sympathy for your research is because I'm an Estonian teacher at a Russian school back in Estonia, so we're dealing with very much similar problems. And I had two questions. First one's probably shorter. In which language was the online survey conducted in? Did the answers have a choice to choose as they did in the not online or like person-to-person survey? And the second was about the discrimination that the Russian speakers brought up when saying that they the view last slides when they said that they felt that they were being discriminated by the state. I assume then, have you researched that? And what are the reasons behind feelings like that? I ask these questions because we deal with similar topics in Estonia. Yes.
Thank you. So, yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention. The online survey was in Ukrainian, but of course I couldn't control what language people respond in. And so 7 people of these 248 responded in Russian fully, and a few people also used elements of English, maybe as a protest against Ukrainization. But remarkably, most Russian speakers responded in fluent Ukrainian because they are fluent in Ukrainian, even both being fluent in Ukrainian. So even though they opposed Ukrainization or discrimination, or perceived discrimination, they still demonstrated it. It's not because I'm not fluent. And mind you, heavily represented among these respondents were people highly educated, many of them with PhD. So they are fluent, but their motivation perceives this discomfort means discrimination is also can be projected on a level of lower educated people, and for those people that means their discomfort comes from being not fluent in Ukrainian. So that's one. Second, discrimination. I did not ask them particularly what they consider discrimination. The main goal of this online survey was to establish the nuances of behavior in different domains in different times with different people, and also nuances of perceptions and motivations. But from what they report, some consider the pressure, so the very pressure to use Ukrainian in workplace, they consider discrimination. And it is unbelievable to some people. Like imagine the pressure to speak English in the workplace in the US to be considered discrimination by a Russian speaker or a Spanish speaker. Yeah. So it's obviously the language of the customers should take priority over the language of the employees. But many people consider this discrimination because I don't have the right. But if you have the right, your customers will not have the right. Yeah, they ignore that. And for many people, discrimination is education. Definitely in education, Ukrainian state recently went, in my opinion, too far. Education in Russian has been discontinued. So in primary school in Russian, and then everything is in Ukrainian. Russian language is now in more discriminated against than even other minority languages. So you can have some mixed education in Ukrainian and Hungarian Ukrainian in Romanian, but not in Ukrainian and Russian after 5th grade. So some people speak about that, but for some people, the very social environment in which everybody wants them to speak Ukrainian is discrimination. So they do not strictly differentiate between pressure, social pressure, and discrimination in the legal sense. For them, like I said, discomfort means discrimination.
If I may ask, do you factor ethnicity into this survey? The issue of ethnic Russians, ethnic Ukrainians, Jews, Tatars, does it play any role here? Because there's certainly a difference between ethnicity and language.
Ethnicity is a tricky thing in Ukraine nowadays. Ethnic composition, reported ethnic composition of Ukrainian society has changed drastically. So in the last Soviet census, we have 22% of people reporting Russian nationality. In the first and only post-Soviet census of 2001, you had 17%. And even that was a huge shift, re-identification of Russians into Ukrainians. But currently, something like 2% of people report Russian nationality. So Russians have disappeared. Russians, meaning, did not die out, definitely. Russians have re-identified into Ukrainians. As my students and I discussed in our classes this week, the boundary between Ukrainians and Russians were not very strict, not very institutionalized. And thus the boundary eroded, and similarly to how many people could shift their identity from Ukrainian to Russian during Soviet times, now they switch back. So, and 2% means you cannot catch them in the service. So there are too few of them. I still separate the nationality, but for many people who still call themselves Russians, their preferences can be in favor of Ukrainian, even though, of course, the share of those who prefer Russian is high among people identifying as Russian. As for other nationalities, they are really too few to be captured in the service, nationwide service. In my focus group, there was one Romanian person in Chernivtsi, and he insisted that he's Romanian speaker, he's Romanian, ethnically Romanian, but he's also Ukrainian patriot. He's fluent in both languages, so his family he speaks Romanian, in public he speaks Ukrainian. Nobody in this online survey reported any ethnicity, so there was no direct question, but nobody brought it in, nobody considered that important. So of these people who strongly preferred Russian and said that this is the language they express themselves in, they live in, probably some of them are Russian by descent, but that's no longer an issue. You can be whoever you want by descent, but now society wants you, allows you and wants you to be like everybody else.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's very important topic and really impressive results. And the way how you interpret the numbers with that. It's really cool. So I think I am interested in the idea of the language of convenience. So like I know that's really hard to measure symbolic choices, opposed to recognizing choice in social interaction. I think that's really a nice way to that, like people can adopt that in different research situations. But I'm not exactly like where I'm just wondering if you look at like dynamics across years and how these dynamics looks like. Because I think you mentioned the law, like the 19th law, and I'm just wondering if respondents speaking to a sociologist after the law, if they might have felt motivated or pressured by the law to speak, like to choose Ukrainian as a language of convenience. Like if they might have considered this as institutionalized interaction where this law applies.
Thank you. It's an interesting question, but from what I know, I didn't have other data in between, but I know results of other surveys. So in 2020, 2021, it didn't seem to me that the change in language of convenience was truly impressive. So there was a gradual change. I reported, but even by 2017 there was a change. Post-Maidan environment with the pro-European government, with the war with Russia, even if it was limited scale, all contributed to the pressure in favor of Ukrainian. But the war was a game changer. The large-scale war was a game changer. So before that, and even in the online survey, many people said when talking about language policies, they said yes, the state policy was important, but nothing like the war. So, in some cases, strictly compare the law and the war, saying, of course, the war was more important motivator for switching to Ukraine.
Thanks for the presentation. implementation, do you have any data or maybe just your sense of how in occupied territories, either currently or ones that have already been liberated, how language use changed both publicly and privately?
I don't have data. I cannot, of course, conduct any surveys there. But from what I read in the media, definitely the occupiers want to eliminate Ukrainian. The first thing they can, they destroy Ukrainian textbooks. They switch to Russian programs and definitely Russian as a language of instruction, and they want to exert pressure on the pupils and parents to get rid of Ukrainian even as a subject of instruction. But there was a report in Zaporizhzhia Oblast that almost half of parents wanted to keep Ukrainian as a subject. They are not allowed to keep Ukrainian as a language of instruction, obviously. But their protests, even under duress, they still wanted to keep Ukrainian as a subject. So that's their patriotic gesture, even though most of them are probably Russian speakers there. But they do not want to sever ties with Ukraine altogether.
Volodymyr, thank you so much for your great talk. Really enjoyed hearing it, especially the Ukraine. Two big questions. Is Russian dead in Ukraine? Is Russian dead in Ukraine? What's the future prospect of the use of Russian in the country? And the second question, has the Ukrainian government reached its limit, how much it can regulate language issues? You mentioned very controversial language laws that have passed. If there is any role left for the Ukrainian government to play to regulate language issues, or popularization of Ukrainian should come from within the society?
Thanks. Russian is not dead. Russian will not be dead. Russian will not become Yiddish or I don't know, Karaim. I tend to agree with this last quote that there is a critical mass of Russian speakers in the big cities of the East and South, and they will keep this environment. They will not let Russian to be marginalized. So that's, I believe, a very sound, very sound assessment. And second, for the limits of intervention, probably yes. No, actually, next step is strict implementation of the law. So the Zelensky government did wisely not to try to revoke or modify the law. It realized that there will be protests, there will be confrontation in society. They didn't need that. What they did instead was mindfully sabotage the use, the implementation of the law in certain practices, especially when they fail them. One example is television. Although on television now, I believe 90% of Ukrainian from nationwide channels is required. For all channels, you cannot have one channel in Ukrainian fully, or 9 channels in Ukrainian fully, and then 1 channel in Russian also. Each channel should have its quota. The parliament established 2 channels in Russian fully, supposedly for the occupied territories. But of course, this license actually covers the entire Ukrainian territory. So these channels, and they didn't modify the law. They didn't make a provision in the law which would say, yes, there might be exceptions, some channels for the occupied territories or something. No, they just ignored the law. They just created these channels and they are fully in Russian. And by the way, Zelensky and his company sell their products to those channels. So they use, because their products were predominantly in Russian, you know. Yeah. So, for example, so strict implementation of the law is the next basic step, and if that is achieved, the reasonable maximum of state interference in democratic society is achieved. Everything else is popularization, everything else is social pressure coming from society, from active parts of society, and language activism is, by the way, very important source of this change in society.
I'm sorry, just before.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much for your presentation. In one of the slides that you had some feedback from a Russian respondent a native Russian speaker who was resisting the language laws, saying that Ukrainian language should be more attractive and more prestigious.
No, that was actually the Ukrainian speaker.
Oh, sorry, okay. I'm intrigued by language prestige. I'm curious to what extent prestige was a recurring theme among the responses that you received, and what people associated with a language's prestige, and what components of prestige are reflected in a language's use.
Thank you. Remarkably, there was no keyword in this online survey at all. Nobody talks of prestige, but, or maybe I'm forgetting something, maybe one or two which I forgot. But basically, prestige was not a prominent word. But in this data, but in public survey discourse, in public discourse in general, especially on social media, there was a lot of talk of how Russian was more prestigious than Ukrainian up until 2014, definitely, maybe even in some domains until the war. How there was a pressure for people who would like to speak Ukrainian, how there was a pressure for them to fall in line and speak Russian. Many people told these stories. There was some company in Ukraine similar to Me Too. Actually, people spoke about their experience of discrimination or pressure as Ukrainian speakers, and how it was hard for them to speak Ukrainian, how they were pressured, how they were bullied, how they were humiliated for trying to speak Ukrainian. So many people spoke about their repeated attempts to start speaking Ukrainian and how they failed, and how they finally, at some point in 2019 or in 2022, found the courage to do so, because society was changing. And this lady who spoke about gradual change, she didn't mention kind of hostile environment, hostile response here. But probably the graduality of change was also due to some pressure not to be too different from society. Yeah, so that's why it was easier to start writing poems in Ukrainian than actually asking a shop person in Ukrainian. Yeah. But Russian kept this high prestige. Russian was in a very more powerful language, and only recently, definitely until Euromaidan, until the state started to interfere. So Russian speakers actually spoke all the time about that. Make Ukraine prestigious, create content in Ukraine, make Ukraine attractive, but just don't pressure us. So we should be free to speak as much Russian as we want, and you can in the meantime make Ukraine prestigious. It didn't work. It can never work. In post-colonial context, which is a crucial thing, Russian had initial advantage. And to overcome this advantage, so this was uneven ground, yeah? So to overcome this advantage, you need state interference. And remarkably, people were in favor of changing the rules, except that they didn't want to do this themselves. Many people wanted the state to change the situation for them rather than themselves bothering. And you could critically assess it, saying, you want somebody to do your job for you. But you should keep in mind how hard it might be for a person in a given environment to go along, kind of contrary to the general mood, to the prevalence in the environment. So some people didn't want to bother, and some people didn't have enough courage, didn't have enough strength in them to overcome becomes the predominant mode.
Final question, please, Dominique.
Yes, thank you so much for a very clear and interesting presentation of your research. I want to ask about the status of English in Ukraine, which I know is something that Zelensky has been trying to elevate in certain ways, making it an official language of international communication. And it struck me that one of your respondents from Kharkiv mentioned that she and her friends would converse in whatever language was most convenient to be understood by each other, whether that be Russian or Ukrainian or English, which I was somewhat surprised to see. So what is the position, I assume much less widespread than Russian in a sense, or maybe not, but what is the position of English in Ukraine currently? And is it changing given the role of the English-speaking world as generally strong allies of Ukraine in the war?
Yes, it is changing. Most people, not most, very many people, maybe it's the majority, said that they speak English with foreigners. So meaning they are proficient enough to have this, at least they wanted to present it. So when asked to present a detailed account of their language behavior in different domains, they mentioned that even those who said, I always speak Ukrainian, say, except when the person doesn't understand Ukrainian, meaning with foreigners. So most of them said, I use English. Some said, oh, I can also use Polish, and some said, oh, if they don't know English, I could use even Russian with Kazakhs or I don't know, Estonians. Yeah. But there was a widespread kind of reportage of English in communication with foreigners. Some people definitely use English even within Ukraine for work. When I asked a question, I didn't report it here, when I asked a question about the third practice, in addition to home and work, I asked the question about the languages used on the internet. And something like 10% of the highly educated people reported using other languages than Ukrainian and Russian. So I assume that's primarily English. So the more affluent, the more educated people are, the more need for English they have. But for many people, 2022, the experience of dislocation, the experience of being abroad also brought the need to speak more English or more German or more Polish. But definitely English remains number one.